July 17th, 1453, southwestern France. The air tastes like copper and ash. In less than an hour, 1,000 years of certainty will collapse into smoke and screaming horses. The English army, led by John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, advances across an open field. These are the descendants of Agincourt's heroes. Knights in plate so polished it catches the sun like mirrors. The finest killers in Christendom. They don't know they're already corpses, because waiting for them isn't another army of knights. It's hundreds of guns, massed behind earthworks, mouths black and patient. Contemporary accounts describe an unprecedented artillery park, a geometry of death no knight had ever faced. This is the battle where the Middle Ages didn't fade, it shattered. To understand what died at Castillon, let's first understand what a knight was. For over 1,000 years, the mounted warrior in armour was the apex predator of warfare. Equipping a single knight consumed years of skilled labour, thousands of hours of blacksmith work, brutal training from childhood, a war horse worth more than villages, and they were worth it. A knight could shatter infantry, crush rebellions, hold castles. They were walking fortresses, mobile siege engines, unkillable. At Crécy in 1346, French knights charged English longbowmen and were slaughtered. At Agincourt in 1415 it happened again. But those were anomalies, mistakes, bad ground, bad luck. The knight always came back. Here's what's fascinating. They couldn't simply adapt, because their entire world was built on one unshakable truth. The man in armour on horseback was supreme. Kings and lords were knights. Power, land, honour, bloodline, identity, all of it flowed from this single axiom. To question the knight was to question God's order. A boy became a page at 7, a squire at 14, a knight at 21, if he survived. Every stage was designed to forge an unbreakable belief. You are the weapon. Your grandfather, father, sons would be knights. It wasn't just a profession, it was a bloodline, a sacred inheritance. And now, on a field in France, that inheritance was about to become a funeral shroud. A rider splashes back from the scouts, dust on the plume, panic in the voice. They're running. That's all Talbot needs. The 100 Years' War had been raging since 1337, a generational death spiral between England and France. By 1453, England held only a sliver of southwestern France. The war was ending, but one man refused. John Talbot was 66 years old in 1453. Think about that. 66. In an era where most men were dead by 40. He'd been fighting the French for nearly 30 years, captured twice, ransomed, returned to battle. He'd watched English power in France collapse piece by piece, town by town, and castle by castle. It was killing him more surely than any blade. The French were besieging Castillon, a key English-held town. Talbot marched to relieve it with around 6,000 men, a mix of English longbowmen and Gascon allies. Not a huge force, but Talbot had one with less. Here's what he didn't know. The French had fundamentally changed how war worked. Jean Bureau, the French master of artillery, was about to make history. While Talbot marched, Bureau was building something unprecedented, a fortified artillery camp. Hundreds of guns arranged in precise kill lanes, protected by earthworks, trenches and stakes. This wasn't a castle. It wasn't a traditional defensive position. It was a system, an industrial death machine. Stakes driven at angles to gut horses, ditches to break charges, elevation to maximize range. Gun mouths staggered to cover overlapping lanes of fire. Bureau understood something revolutionary. You don't need to kill every enemy. You need to break their formation, shatter their cohesion, turn an army into a mob, and cannons did that better than anything in history. Now here's where it gets fascinating, because Talbot wasn't stupid. He was one of the most experienced commanders in Europe, so why did he attack? The answer reveals something profound about how hard it is to see your own world ending. The morning of July 17th, Talbot's scouts reported the French artillery camp, and here's the crucial detail. They saw French soldiers apparently fleeing. This looked like victory, like the enemy was breaking before Talbot even arrived. It was a lie. Bureau had sent out a small raiding party earlier that morning. When they saw Talbot's army approaching, they retreated to the fortified camp, exactly as planned. To Talbot's scouts, it looked like a rout. Talbot's officers advised caution, wait for reinforcements, scout the position. His lieutenants begged him to wait just one day, but Talbot was 66 years old, and he'd spent his entire life being a knight. Knights don't wait, they don't hesitate, they charge. He was trapped by his own identity. He declared that he would not be accused of cowardice in his old age. He felt his honour was at stake. 66 years of victories, of being the English commander in France. And now, whispers that maybe he was too old, too cautious and too afraid. For a man like Talbot, this was worse than death. So he made the choice that would end him and his world. But how did Talbot's oath leave him exposed? He had given the order. The English knights, in full armour, began their advance across the open field toward Bureau's camp. Perunin, an archer, voice tight, "I see the white horse." The ground kicks first, and Bureau lits the fuses. 3, 2, 1. Then the field changes shape. Hundreds of cannons firing in coordinated volleys, not randomly, not sporadically, in waves. Bureau had turned artillery into a science. The sound alone was unprecedented, a continuous bone-deep roar historians describe as unlike anything knights had heard. Horses went mad with terror, some threw their riders before the first volley even landed, but it was the iron that did the killing. Heavy shots smashing through formations. It was described as shot and case tearing lanes through close-packed ranks where men and horses were simply erased from existence. The English advance didn't slow down. It disintegrated. Here's the horrifying detail. Armour, that supreme protection that had defined military power for a millennium, made it worse. A knight's plate armour was designed to deflect swords, arrows, lances. Against heavy shot, it offered little. Impacts unhorsed and disabled through force alone. The weight that made you invincible now made you a target. A cannonball doesn't care about your lineage, it just erases you. Talbot tried to rally his men. This was what commanders did. This was duty. Through the smoke, he could see his formations collapsing. Men he'd fought beside for decades, dying in ways that made no sense. A cannonball struck his horse. He was thrown to the ground, pinned beneath his dying warhorse. 1,500 pounds of screaming muscle and shattered bone. Gascon infantry saw the legendary English commander trapped and helpless. They did not meet him in ritual combat. With his horse brought down by shot and Talbot pinned, he was killed at close quarters. The Earl of Shrewsbury, hero of a dozen battles, died in the mud, not in glory, in obsolescence. In a single day, everything changed. Fighting was briefcase 3 under an hour, but the ripple effects are still shaping the world today. Because Castillon didn't just end a battle, it ended an entire way of understanding power. The Battle of Castillon effectively ended the 100 Years' War. England lost its last major holdings in France except for Calais. That's the history textbook version. But here's what really happened. The monopoly on violence broke. For 1,000 years, if you wanted military power, you needed knights. and knights required massive wealth, land, resources, years of training. This meant power naturally concentrated in the hands of a feudal aristocracy. Gunpowder warfare ended the knights' dominance, not overnight, but decisively. Gunpowder compressed the training gap. Disciplined infantry with firearms could threaten armoured nobles at range. The return on investment for violence fundamentally shifted. Within a century, every major European power was building standing armies of commoners with gunpowder weapons. The knight became ceremonial, then obsolete, then a historical curiosity. Traditional castles gave way to artillery-resistant works and eventually star-fort logic. Armour became a parade dress. The entire social structure that had defined Europe for a millennium, where the military value determined social status, collapsed. But here's the deeper transformation. Gunpowder widened access to effective force, shifting power towards states and paid infantry. Many scholars argue politics followed. When any group can effectively resist through force, you need new ways to organize society. I'm not saying gunpowder directly caused democracy. History is never that simple. But I am saying that when you change who can effectively use violence, you change everything. The line from Castillon's cannons to the modern nation-state isn't straight, but it's real. John Talbot's body was found the next day and identified by those who knew him. Sources differ on the exact circumstances. They buried him at Castillon. The French went on to use artillery to systematically reduce every remaining English castle in France. Not through starvation, not through siege, but simply pointing cannons at walls that had stood for centuries and demolishing them. Stones that had protected lords for generations became dust in the afternoon. Within a generation, no military theorist seriously argued that knights were the future of warfare. The sons of knights became administrators, courtiers, diplomats. The armour stayed in the hall, polished, displayed and empty. But here's what is haunting about Castillon. Many scholars argue Talbot could have won. If he'd waited one day for reinforcements, scouted the artillery position properly, and adapted his tactics to the new reality, he couldn't. Not because he was stupid, but because his entire identity was built on being a knight. Changing would mean admitting that everything he was, everything he'd built his life around, was obsolete. And here's the terrifying part. He probably knew. Somewhere deep down, Talbot understood the world had changed. That's why he charged. Not despite knowing it was suicide, but because of it. Better to die as a knight than live as a relic. How many of us are doing the same thing right now? Charging toward our own cannons because turning back would mean admitting our world already changed. Clinging to identities that no longer serve us because letting go feels like death. The old world died at Castillon, not because it was weak, but because it couldn't imagine being anything else. Hundreds of guns, one day, and the knight's dominance was over. The silence that followed was the sound of 1,000 years ending, and in that silence you could hear the future, cold, mechanical, and utterly indifferent to honour. The age of the individual warrior was over, and the age of the system had begun.